is as much the story of literary imagination and genius as it is about all of the things we often distance and call the extra literary. All through Network's Poetics, Sachs mobilizes the construction not necessarily as a theoretical frame, but more intriguingly as a habit, one which consistently forces attention on the relationship between ideas, genres, categories, and temporality. To appreciate how this manifests concretely in the book that is this deconstructionist attitude, we may consider the way she places the digital in direct conversation with the oral and the literary. In this regard, one may note, of course, that the relationship between orality, literacy, and digitality itself has long been considered by the literary scholar and philosopher Walter Ong in his landmark work, Orality and Literacy, the Technologizing of the World. That's the 1963 book. Thinking with the notion of secondary orality, Ong points in that book to what he regards as, quote, a new orality that is sustained by telephone, radio, television, and other electronic devices that depend for their existence on writing and print, unquote. In Network's Poetics, Sachs extends this line of research to highlight how performance, literacy, and digitality are imbricated in the contemporary poetic forms that she attends to. A related insight of this book, along the deeply historical line I've been speaking of here, is its comparative consideration of the past and the present of African literature and of the shifting, expansively plural traditions that mark the literature. And I think Professor Igole was just speaking about, thinking about the past and the present. In thinking about the digital transformations of African literature, and particularly poetry, Sachs urges us to abandon the tendency to speak of everything in quite mean terms, and I find this to be very, 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 very important. This critical attitude allows her, in this case, to historicize what she describes, quote, as the digital turn in African literature, as both old and novel. The precise argument that she makes in this respect, and which resonates so powerfully with the spirit of another excellent and phenomenal book by Akandisha Kozadis, Everything is Sampled, Digital and Print Mediations in African Arts and Letters. This argument is that the digital is not exactly new, if we think very broadly in historical terms. A view that reminds one of Henry Jenkins' point in convergence culture, that cultural developments are gradual and continuous, rather than totally eruptive and discontinuous, and that rather than displace each other, quote, each medium is forced to coexist with different imagined media, unquote. Sachs makes this point in order to call attention to how 21st century African poetry views on 20th century poetic traditions, rather than mark a break and totally new tradition. The author's own words on the opening pages of the book are significant in this regard. Quote, I begin the study with a brief overview of the regional history of political poetry in order to emphasize the way digital poetry views on locally specific poetic forms with much longer histories, unquote. In mapping out the temporal crossings mentioned here, the author takes performance as one of such ways of tracking them. That is, if we have always understood performance as something that brings the artist and their audience together in direct face-to-face or virtual interaction, Sachs modified this way of thinking a little bit to emphasize the way that poetry's fundamental embodiment, whether realized on the stage, in electronic recordings, or on the page, always already links it with the future life of African arts, which I think are essentially multimodal. Sachs invites us to consider, for instance, how the centrality of sound work to poetry places it in the realm of performance, since to sound require the use of the body, or at least the imitation and the imagination of the facility of speech and the body. But beyond sound, we are also being asked to think of the digital life of African poetry in terms of the unmarked features of performance, including participation and artist-audience interaction. Interestingly, the point about participation explored here also finds an earlier clarification in the Jenkins work mentioned earlier, where he, that is Jenkins, points to participation as one of the landmark features of digital media and culture. Okay. I don't think I can do this in 3 minutes, so I'll okay. All right.
Who knows? We might still come back to it.
Yeah.
I want to give everybody their time under the sun.
Yes, as you should. Okay, I begin to round up. As I begin to round off, it is important to know that network poetics organized structurally around what the author calls popular sites of poetic reception is not merely about the celebration of the digital transformations of African poetry. It is indeed also an attentive reading of the poetry's tragedies, containment, and disciplinary domestication by capital. More precisely, it is a sad reminder of how amidst all the excitement about the digital novelty in African poetry and literature, coloniality stands as a mockingbird, miming, regulating, and repeating OT. In chapter 4, Sachs examines this question by considering how 3,000 African poetry festivals highlight contemporary African literature's entanglement with capital and colonial continuities. She traces this in terms of how the global and the cosmopolitan reach of African digital poetry ironically invites to it, whether online or offline, as in the festivals, certain expectations about the formulaic performances of the African authentic, exotic, and to put it in another way, primitive. In a sense, Sachs focused on how the global operates to fix and stabilize the local rather than fold it into cohesiveness, connects with another important argument in the book. In this regard, the author insists that while it is right and even expected that we appreciate and celebrate the innovations in digital African poetry and literature, it is equally significant that such appreciation and celebration is placed side by side with how this poetry and literature obey the capitalist rules of platforms and algorithms, of individualism and competition, and of the strategic fashioning of the African self in search of cultural and social capital. Here, the digital makes African poetic innovations possible, but at the same time has a tendency to convert African poetry into formula, into fast food models in which what matter per se are immediacy, regularity, consistency, and uniformity. This brilliant point is what I connected it's what I connected at the start of this presentation to the constructionist imagination that structures the book. To round off, finally, I have just one question that we may sort of think about. On page 124 of the book, the author is reciting and locates contemporary poetry festivals, in quote, 19th century arts festivals in Europe. While I think this is indeed one of the sources of such festivals, I wonder what relationship exists between contemporary African poetry festivals and the long traditions of poetry festivals in West Africa, for example, where we have Uje Festival, extensively documented by Tanjo Jaide. Okay, pardon, Uje. Okay, thank you so much. I've always been calling it
Uje, that's Urobo.
Okay, thank you. I need an Urobo friend so that
Indeed, flow.
Okay, pardon, Festival, the griots agonistic poetry of war that is the subject of Barbara Hoffman's Griots at War, Conflict, Conciliation, and Curse in Monday, and the Eve battle song that Daniel Agbogbedor has broadly considered. Like, what kind of relationship can we think about? I want to end by congratulating Susanna on this book. I've found a lot of joy reading this book. So congrats and thank you. And of course, it's really great to be in conversation with you here in Nigeria and West Africa, even though the book is on Southern African poetry, but that kind of very, comparative analysis is very important. So thank you.
Yeah, that was another mind-blowing performance, and we are so blessed to have these great people here with us. And I wish we had a full house, and teaching, talking is just like the actor on the stage. If you play to an open theater or audience, you won't be able to say anything, you just be stuttering. But if the theater is full, and everybody is there, you see that you'll be at your best. So you just look around and find a lot of empty spaces and, empty seats and begin to wonder what is going on. This is a university, for God's sake. People should be here. But I'm hoping that this will be recorded, or there will be a way of creating it and really making people see it and listen to it over and again, because this is invaluable material for research, both for established faculty members and people coming through, including early beginners, middle level career people, and of course our students. So we are going to yield space to Gabriel Bamboshe. Are you the son of the same Ayo Bamboshe and everything? Any relationship? Okay, the doyen of African linguistics, Ayo Bamboshe. It's not 93, So when I saw it, I said I was going to ask whether you are related to Ayo Bamboshe. Yeah, wonderful. So you're going to talk to us for 10 minutes. Your time starts now.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to begin by congratulating you, Susanna, for writing this beautiful book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's like I don't want any word to escape. Wow, literally. Of course, I want to thank the organizers of this conference and, of course, those who have spoken earlier. I have a disjointed note I'm going to speak to, and I want to begin with a series of questions that this book, helped me think about. What does it mean to produce poetry, to adapt Walter Benjamin's language in the age of digital reproduction? What has poetry become in this age? How do poets think and style themselves and their work in digital spaces that collapse publication and communication media? How are poetry published reconstituted on digital platforms? In fact, what happened to the poetic form in the context of communities created through and around digital technologies? And how do we understand the poet as an author in the digital conditions of co-production of writing and reading, composition and circulation, imagination and conventions? These are some of the profound questions raised and incisively explored in Sachs' network Poetics. A major contribution to modern African discourse, the book argues that digital network and algorithm aesthetics shape poetic forms in profound ways that compel a rethinking of the theory of African poetry. Taking an unbounded regional approach, and by unbounded, even though the book is talking about Southern Africa, it takes a multi-scalar approach by looking at the region in the context of the nation and in the context of the global, right? So the regional is also, bound to the national poetics, the local or translocal poetics, and of course the global formations of poetry. Sachs' study focuses on the digital transformation of the poetic art in Southern African region with a specific focus on 21st century South African, Malawian, and Zimbabwean vibrant African poetry scenes. The methodology, which the author describes as comparative netography, blends ethnography and formal analysis of poems to illuminate the production and reception of digital poetic forms and their shifting networks. In this way, Sachs' intervention situates Southern African poetry, and in fact, we can extrapolate to say African poetry writ large in the interdisciplinary fields of global poetics, digital humanities, post-colonial, and world literary studies. The book tracks the complementary processes of network making and algorithmic formations of poetry performance produced online and offline to read how digital poetry, and I'm quoting from the author, bridges the live and the mediated. And I think for me, this is the most brilliant part of the book, and I was discussing that with Tosin when we were coming. Because this book is asking us to think about how tradition, for example, protest tradition in the first chapter, informs digital practices, digital art production, but then asks us to look at the feedback in terms of how the digital also shapes non-digital forms. For example, slam poetry, right? Slam poetry, poetics is in fact informed by, YouTube video productions that sort of, produce poetry in 2 to 3 to 5 minutes. And then those forms of, algorithmic aesthetics are transposed offline, literary production. I think it's brilliant to kind of think about the impossibility of thinking the digital and the non-digital in binary terms. So that's a deconstruction move that asks us to think about, in fact, how on the ground and online networks, in fact, collapse in these articulations of poetry in the modern age, in the 21st century and digital age. This bridging compellingly foregrounds the simultaneity of the digital and the grounded in ways that redefine poetry as inherently, and I'm quoting the author now, a networked form. Repeatedly, Sachs reminds us poetry is a networked form. And in fact, that is not new because orality is in fact a form of network, right? And actually, Bembe was telling us the digital before. the digital forms, in Africa. Nonetheless, Sachs' book shows that the digital reconfiguration of the network brings something new to the already networked form. So we are thinking about the multi-layer of networks, in terms of the articulation of 21st century digital poetry. Network poetics follows these ideas in 5 chapters, and I'm looking at my time, I have 5 more minutes. But for the purpose of those who are interested in reading this book, I just want to give you a teaser, and I don't want to, escape this point. Yeah, the first chapter addresses, because I think it's important to also see the different forms, of poetry produced through digital mediation.
Thank you for that.
The first chapter addresses the forms of what the author called tactical poetry, produced in the context of collective protest in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. And of course, this raises the question of voice and community. What does it mean for hashtag to become a chant? And I think that's compelling to think about those moments where we can't actually owe to these binary distinctions, of hashtag and chant, because hashtag can in fact create connectivities that enable the movement of these chants. And the second chapter, the book explores social media poetry, paying careful attention, and I so much enjoy this, to the affordances of WhatsApp poetry, Facebook, and Instagram that generates different digital forms. In fact, the author is asking us to think about what are the peculiarities, or if you want, the singularities of each form. For example, how does, the modalities of WhatsApp shape certain forms of poetry production, or Instagram, or Facebook with macro images, right? And in the third chapter, we move to slam. And this is where it begins to get exciting, for me, exciting, because the author makes us think about slam poetry and how digital aesthetic modalities and algorithmic curation reconstitute live poetry performance. And of course, thinking about the institutions, shaping that. So we begin to see how the algorithm mimics the institution, right? There's a kind of like a feedback loop of this kind of mimicry, right? So the institution mimics the algorithm also mimics, the institution. And moving in a different direction in the fourth chapter, the author addresses the digital and institutional networks of poetry festivals. Can you imagine that you're in a festival, activities going on, but the author is asking us to think about how precisely does the algorithmic curation or digital aesthetics shape what we see as poetry festival or music festival that centers poetry. And of course, at stake in that conversation, as mentioned by Tosin earlier, is the tension between nationalism and cosmopolitanism in the popular appeal of performance poetry. And the fifth chapter, I have 2 minutes left, highlights the problem of the canon. How do we think about the canon formation, right? That negotiates, let's say, the relationality between the digital and the print landscape. And I'm so excited about that chapter because it looks at collective tumor. I've taught that test before, collective amnesia, and I was introduced by Stefan Rowling. Yeah, so, but that chapter makes me think about, if you want, the other lives of that particular print text. And these are the kind of things we can't read in the text, but the author's, thinking helps us to understand how this print text, in fact, is shaped by digital modalities that are not really visible in the text. So it's like you are catching the digital spirits of the print text. And sometimes spirits are unseen forces, they are unknowable, but the text, the author devises this methodology that enables us to see the diverse mode of conversation that shape that text. And I think my time is up, but I really just wanted to say there is a lot to unpack, and we would have the time for conversation.
Yeah, there will be time for all of that.
But I have just one question, because I'm really interested, in this question of how algorithm works. You are asking us to think about the movement of algorithm. And the whole idea of the digital as an open space is also an illusion. It's sort of like a mirage, because the freedom is also constrained, right? So, but I wonder if the algorithmic feeds on data accumulation, right? So I wonder if there's a feedback loop in terms of how those digital production that exist there also kind of recalibrate the algorithm itself.
For sure.
And we can have a lot of fun, because I have a piece on Yoruba poetry, you know, and the digital forms, which of course are not legible to this Anglo-centric, you know, space. So I think it's worth thinking about in terms of, you know, those feedbacks. Thank you.
Put your hands together, please. Now, Gabi. That was, so you're into oral poetry also in Yoruba and things like that.
I'm a comparative, so I study poetry across
Okay.
languages in West and Central Africa.
Fantastic. Man, of course, those of you who are sitting there and, you know, those of us who are here, you can see that it's been beautiful. You know, we've run out of superlatives, and we are really very blessed that we are getting great, you know, great minds talking and exploring poetry the way it should be explored. We are going to go online now, so to speak, to hear the only member of the panel that is going to speak to us online, from online. So, Oladele Adejobi, if you can hear me, I would like you to speak to us. You are going to speak to us for 10 minutes. Say hello. Let's know whether we can hear you so that we can take care of all the logistics. Hello. Yeah, we can hear you. Okay. 10 minutes. Your time starts now. It's clear. We can hear you. Go on.
Let me start by thanking the organizers of the LSA for this doctrine and for the program in its totality itself. Then straight to my business here, which is Susanna Networked Poetics. I'd like to just say some few things. So I may not go by the way of my earlier speakers. They've done big justice. Justice is work. Yeah, Poetics, the way I've seen this work, simply, and if I'm putting the author herself, is a marriage of the traditional. And that is how I like to see this book. Well, a number of ideas pop up, and I want to react to that. Those ones. One, network poetics, I have seen, we also made it a leitmotif that kept popping up from different perspectives. So, and if one must count, one will see that poetry is now a network app, like the last speaker just said. We see poetry as an effective tool for activism, that we are able to see in the hashtag chapter 1. We see network poetry as a tool for self-publication, where people now digital self-publishing as well. Additionally, you know, we see network poetics also from the point of view of digital capital that can be interpreted in so many fronts. So with that, one big the new insights this has brought to the fore. For me, I think the book came very, very timely because I'm teaching a writing class, and I just found this material as a very, very resource material that helped me to look at that course from a very fresh perspective. So that's just to tell us that computer mediation is the next place to go. Having said that, I'd like to talk about the algorithmic that the author has also frontlined. I think when we say algorithmic aesthetics, I'm looking at it from the point of view of censoring, from checking what goes to and where. What I would like to ask the author from this point of view is there any suggestion or can there be any recommendation from our part to see how what the poets, of the poets that each poet has decided to push to the media, how it can become maybe a little bit unchecked. Yes, I'm aware that she said that it's all of these are determined by Facebook, all these social media. How do I put that now? Mechanisms to censor what goes to who. So I would like to know, from my perspective, how this kind of supposed barrier can be overcome, since from the idea of network poetics that she has put forward here, we seem to have no way out. This is the next future. Then secondly, author Susanna L. Sachs mixed a lot of ideas together in the idea of she referring to poetry in some instances as spoken word, and in some instances some music lyrics, in some instances and refer to some poets as verbal artists. I would have thought that we try to bring all of this down to one idea, which is poetry, or we kind of give one of these different components that make up poetry, in our own opinion. You know, we separate them and use one particularly. Take for somebody mentioned oral literature, something coming from Nigeria. You know, that could be a simple focus, a direct focus, from having to mop up musical lyrics with what you call chants and the rest of them. So I think what should have been, or what I expected from that. So what I'm trying, this work.
Dele, you have 3 minutes to go. 3 minutes to go. Correct.
This work is a barrier breaker for me. It has contributed a new perspective to how I see some of the courses I teach now. I'm grateful for what she's done, and those are the questions I would like to. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Very quickly, we are going to listen to Funke Awodiya. She will speak, and then I will say 1 or 2 things. Then we'll bring on the author to speak to us, and we will try and interface with members of the audience. They might have something to say and all of that, so that and a lot of people seem to have something to also add, even from this side. They want to tie up their argument, maybe concluding remarks and things like that. We want to make sure we manage our 1.5 hour time. That's exactly what we want to do. We don't want to just play around. We want to make sure we use our time well. So being given 10 minutes to talk, I think it's good enough. And later you now have maybe like 2 minutes, everybody speaks. And at the end of the day, we know we have a worthwhile time. The time we come, sparks will fly. If there are no sparks, I will create some. I am giving you that for free. So, and they will not have that. So yeah, okay.
Thank you, bro.
Okay.
I read the part that it says spark to fly. I think I got my spark watch for listening. For me, I was able to finish the book, but while I was reading, it's so clear to me that I know the reason why I should be on this panel. The reason why I am on this panel is because your book has just described my journey as a poet and the journey of some other poets in the network from the Nigerian perspective. I've been writing as a child, but you know, when you are told that the heart is not for the serious-minded people, that's why I did not study something like English language or whatever. I was pushed into commercial class. But yes, and I studied banking and finance and diploma, and I did not know jack about everything that I have studied. That I was writing. So when it was time to choose the course, I studied sociology, but I did not stop writing. But where I'm thinking my lived experience connected with what you have here is that the advent of Facebook changed my story as a writer. So while I started posting what I did not consider to be poetry at that time, just my diary and everything, and I started getting reactions, and that linked me with network of poets. Each time I go back to this faculty, I remember how I come from Alambado to attend Association of Nigerian Authors reading just to come and listen to poetry. And from there, through social media, I was able to connect with a lot of poetry programs, festivals, and your book is looking into the lives of individuals like me who found their voice through digital literature, the digital space. Now, as I teach sociology in my classes, when I understand my students are not, they're not getting my points, I break the class and do a poetry performance. Yeah, sometimes I end my classes with poetry performances. Before I knew it, they were making content out of my classes.
Wow.
Yes. And people started calling my attention to it. So I started seeing myself as a poet due to interaction from the digital space. Now, your book, when you were talking about a virtual World Poetry Day, every day in my university, every World Poetry Day in my university, I organize World Poetry Day on radio. So why am I doing that? I believe that I should use my network base to connect with people like me who did not consider themselves to be poets, but they are writing. So this book, I see it from the perspective of looking into the lives of some people who were not really visible before now. Not visible because we feel like we did not study English language. Yeah. We did not study language. So what are we doing with poetry? But the network poetics is just like mirroring the lives of these individuals from this part of the world. And I can relate with it more from the perspective of someone who is experiencing this. Now, digital poetry and global creative economy. This chapter is very, very important because each time we talk about what does the creative get from all this production, I know that if poetry and whatever people do on social media space around their work is channeled properly, they can benefit. So I believe this is a good book. When I'm done reading, like I said, I know that I want to connect with the author. At this point, I want to stop with that.
Wow. All right, thank you very much. Yeah. I was just trying to check one or two things online. Just give me a minute. Okay. Yes, I did say that sparks will fly in case you do not have any sparks. I was really trying to make a joke. Sparks are not going to fly. But I have a few things I jotted down here that I felt I should share with us. On a particular page here, Susanna talks about oral legacies. And I thought that wasn't explored sufficiently well in the book. She talked about, Mbogo in South Africa. And you have counterparts of Mbogo both in the oral continent, which means that Africa is overwhelmingly phonocentric rather than logocentric. We are more of an outgoing people, outdoor people, and things like that. Okay, so, and it goes way back to our past. So it's important when you look at what young people are doing today, you want to see how their work intersect with their, heritage, how it intersects with their legacy and all of that. You want to ask yourself the question, what South African youth are doing with slam poetry, with poetry festival, and so on and so forth. How, does that work intersect with the heritage of the praise poetry they have, the Mbogo? The Mbo guy, for instance, which is the poet who goes around and chants and things like that. We also want to see how that intersects with the historical experience of apartheid, that they had to use that culture of, principled resistance and so on and so forth against what they consider evil and things like that. Now that they are living in a post-colonial environment, and how are they indeed tapping, how are they drawing upon the cornucopia of tradition, which is represented by the oral traditions of chants, of songs, of protest and the rest of it. Because we do know that South Africans are given to energetic exertions when it comes to these things, and and the rest of it. When you listen to their national anthem alone, it's something that moves you. It's as if it is protest oriented. So we see that there. And Irele, for instance, in his book, The African Experience in Literature and Ideology, he argues in that book that what indeed constitutes African literature is literature written in African languages, not literature written in English languages or written in English language. And we know that in 1962, during the African Writers Conference in Makerere, when they discussed the issue of the language question, Obiwali argued that so long as African writers continue to write in the language of the metropolitan West, that African literature will continue to be, a kind of an appendage to Western literature, and that culture, that continuing culture of writing in Western languages will be a sad reminder, of our continuing dependence on the West. So I just looked at your work from start to finish, and I realized that most of the data, most of the material you use are usually in English. So I was wondering if you should have interrogated poetry in Isuzulu, for instance, in Sotho, and all those languages and all of that. Of course, you did, but you see that your data is overwhelmingly English. So how representative are those digital performances of the poetry tradition of these three countries, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, that you looked at? So I just thought it's important we look at that. So which brings into focus the whole idea of translation, because you are not African, and for you to be able to do serious work on authentic African literature, you need somebody to interpret, or you need somebody to translate for you. But I thought you were more interested in just looking at the English language works that they were putting out there in the form of, the Fallist movement, and the resistance against the government of Banda, and of course that of Robert Mugabe and the rest of it, all of them couched in English. So for me, in fact, there was a bit of self-indictment going on here when you talk about digital normativity. You also talked about, poetic Anglo-centricism. I'm picking these are phrases from your work. So I couldn't have put it better. So if the work you are doing here now has these aphoretic moments of, digital Anglo-normativity, and you are looking at poetic, Anglo or even Western, you just focuses it on Western. So it's like it gives that image of forced universalism. Then you begin to wonder what is there that we can say this is authentic African and all of that. So we will come to the issue of authenticity in a second. And what I put here is that Africa boasts a huge amount of poets of the first, second, third generation, writers such as Dennis Brutus. I didn't see any kind of link between what the youth are doing in South Africa and the work of, say, Dennis Brutus, Masisi Kunene, and all those frontline, writers who fought apartheid to a standstill. I didn't say it there in South Africa, and look at Dambuzo Machereta, for instance, in, what that country, Zimbabwe now. So I thought we could get some of his influence in the work, and another thing I just felt that there should have been some kind of discernible intertextual indebtedness on the part of these cultural netizens. Somebody coined that word. I think it was Yeku that talked about cultural netizenship, of people who are now online, who write poetry and things like that. The poetry they are writing, how rooted are they? How, deep are they? What's the link in terms of intertextuality to their oral past? That is exactly what I feel we should talk about. And that brings me to the question of the quality of poetry itself, the quality of what we are celebrating as poetry. We talk about chants, songs, holas, slogans, and these are packaged and praised as quote and unquote poetry. And I'm asking, can't African artists or artists do better than this? What, after all, is poetry? What constitutes poetry that we're talking about? Is it just slang? Is it just spoken word performances? Is poetry an all-comers affairs? Because if we go back to the past, you realize that for you to be a poet in Africa, it follows what they call the guild system. Just as if you want to be a blacksmith, you need to belong to the blacksmith movement. If you want to be a drummer, if you read Kamaralaye's Radiance of the King, for instance, or The African Child, you see that you need to be initiated into the court for you to do that. If you read Kamaralaye's Radiance of the King, Clarence comes from the West and he sees people beating drum and he does not understand it. And if you read the Bible, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 or so, you say, if the drum gives an uncertain sound, who will prepare himself for battle? Meaning that for you to beat the drum, you don't just make uncertain sound. There's a way you call it. That's why I say talking drum. And you do not just get into it. There is a period of apprenticeship. They have the secrets of the trade. You learn under, the tutelage of a master, sometimes over a period of 7 years. So what period of tutelage have these young people gone through in saying you are writing poetry and the rest of it? It's just being able to string rhymes. Words that rhyme together, does that qualify someone for a poet? Fine, we are going to say we are going back to this conservative, patriarchal, gerontocratic, mindset of the past. That poetry is being democratized. It's taken away from the posh protocol of classroom pedagogy, right into the pervasive person, epicenter of the marketplace. It's now an all-comers affair. What's important is that you can chant, you can do this, you can do that. There is no need for you to undergo training, no need for you to go undergo apprenticeship. You don't become a professor overnight. Now you guys know what you go through to become a professor. And whatever you want to do, you really have to, Thank you. So
yeah,
what?
I plotted that for you.
Eh?
I plotted a proof for you.
Yes. Well, say plotted a proof for you.
He said 30 minutes. I have 30 minutes to go. Oh, but yeah, I know we have 30 minutes because we are rounding off. Don't worry. So the point I'm making is that you see there's a place for, as far as I'm concerned, for tutelage, for training that the poet must undergo. Now, on page 121 and on page 127, Susanna talks about the fetishization of authenticity. And I think it's like calling a dog a bad name in order to hang it. Because if you are not authentic, then what are you? The issue of authenticity is a huge one in Africa, African studies. It's a huge one in literature. That is it. You don't know where you are coming from, then you have to forget about it. So the idea we are trying to make here is that, I know I have very little time left. The point I want to make is that we must indeed talk about the issue of authenticity, because the creation, the production, the circulation, and the reception of African poetry is now being mediated through Western power structures, and maybe people who will give you prizes, give you aids, give you grants, and the rest of it. And that is how you can be validated, whether you're a great writer and the rest of it. So I feel it's time for African writers, both those in Southern Africa and West Africa and all, for them to look right into their hearts. As Sir Philip Sidney will say in Estupe and Stella, look into your heart and write. So you need to look right into their heart and write. The issue of authenticity is there. Otherwise, in this rampaging age of globalization of culture, then language preservation, the return to mother tongue pedagogy, you being able to defend your own cultural selfhood and subjectivity is so critically vital and important. Much as Susanna L. Sachs has done great work and very well written and excellently packaged work here, I feel that this work can be a springboard for a plethora of research work that can be done going forward so that we can have a more holistic and full-orbed interrogation of experience. Thank you for listening. That said, we are going to bring on Susan. Susan will speak to us. You have 10 minutes to speak. We have 30 minutes really. So you will speak for 10 minutes. You may speak less. Then we will now throw it open, ask people to ask questions, and we'll go around again. Maybe we will not speak for another maybe five minutes or 2 minutes, and then we see how we can go. So Susan, it's up to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these comments. Thank you everyone for being here. It's really kind of an unimaginable honor to me to have been invited at all, to have had this level of response and thoughtful response to the project. I've had the opportunity to think with a couple of you for the last 8 years about this. So I know it's not new work for everyone, but it's truly been eye-opening to get to hear it reflected back and thought through. And I've written so much of just brilliant ideas that are coming out of it that I really, really appreciate. So I think what I'm going to do is kind of situate the book, though of course it's already been pretty well described collectively at this point. And then maybe as I talk through my motivation and findings, try to address a lot of the questions that have come up around generational shifts, access to or linguistic access to these platforms, agency and control and power, and how this all fits together with our general understanding and perhaps shifting understanding of what poetry is and does and what we want to claim poetry for. Because I think that's part of what I see underlying some of these comments is our shifting and deep attachments to an understanding of what poetic production, expression means and can be. And this book really started out for me as part of a project where I wanted to understand how poetry worked in its world, because I really feel, and I think this is not going to be surprising given what we've talked about, that understanding poetry means understanding poetry's social world. And that means in part resisting received ideas that I got in my education of poetry as set apart, as purely sacred or removed from everyday concerns. And instead it was really important to me, it is really important to me to think about poetry as part of everyday life, as part of our lived public political experiences, whether that's institutional or social. And that entwinement is what led to my digital interests. It was really, okay, it's so lovely to hear your experience because it was in these conversations, I came to this thinking I'm going to talk about literally this question. I wanted to learn the legacy of Izzy Bongo and Dennis Brutus and Masisi Kunene in South Africa. I wanted to understand how contemporary Malawian poets and youth poets were picking up Steve Chimongo's work and David Rubadiri's. And what I caught was, let me talk to you about the slam poetry I'm seeing. And it didn't feel right to me as someone who's not African to come in and say, actually, this is the poetry that you should be concerned about. Instead, I was really interested to understand how these global media flows were shaping contemporary ideas about what poetry is or could be. I had this one remarkable experience that I think I write about in the 3rd chapter of going to a spoken word night in Blantyre in Malawi. That was going to be about influence, and I was so excited. I was 2nd year graduate student. I was like, this is going to be, I'm going to open up the world of Malawian poetry to myself because that's, some of what you do, and talk to poets about who's influencing them. And what I heard, in addition to Malawian poetry, in addition to Steve Chimongo, was American slam poetry. And what I came to was an understanding of the way that for these youth poets, that connection opened up different worlds, opened up different ways of engaging. And this was then what I really wanted to think through, was how these ideas, forms of poetry that I was seeing in my interviews, in my own close readings of individual poetry, were shaped by and acting upon the digital platforms that artists were moving through, and then what that meant for the future of poetry in places with such deep poetic histories and lineages, but where youth are facing real and tangible pressures around what it means to express oneself and to whom. So I want to get here to some of the questions and be attentive to my time around these really concrete concerns around, let's start with language, right? Because I was writing about Chichewa poetry and I am interested in that. But a lot of the Malawian poets I interviewed over and over said to me, well, if I write in Chichewa, I only speak to Malawians, but I want to speak to everyone. And so I write in English. A, and or B, I'm being educated in English. I'm reading poetry in English. So that's what I'm writing in. And so these legacies and concerns around the history of Chichewa poetry are very present. And yet I think that there is a felt pressure among some artists to respond to this. There's also, to my mind, a question of my own positionality as a researcher and what their artists might say to me based on what they think I want to hear. I do think that's a concern that I try to bring. But I had this sense that there's a tension then between what my local community wants and how I position myself in a global poetic landscape that is salient on these platforms. They're also often speaking in transnational Pan-African contexts where translation can feel to them like a frustration, and English is a lingua franca. Now that's complicated, of course. It's also something that's carried in the legacy of anti-apartheid poetry in South Africa, but it is part of the discourse there. However, it is not universal and it is not all-encompassing. So, Henry, your opening point about this question of generationality, who has access to this poetry and how, I think, is really important and valuable. There's generational divides, there are regional, urban, rural divides, as we might expect. And that is tied into technological access. It's also tied into technological access and literacy. It's also tied into ideas about whose sociality poetry intercedes in and where. But ultimately, I do, and this is probably my limitation, so I'm excited to hear if others have more reflections. I do take a somewhat, I suppose, pessimistic view about the way that platforms constrain us. That's not to say that there's not agency, right? Artists choose how they navigate these platforms. I'm currently working on a project comparing one poem across about 8 different platforms to see how this one artist is attuned to the medium and uses that attunement to try to reach his audience in all those different ways and ensure that this poem can speak widely, right? Everyone has those moments. But I think, and I think it was Gabriel who brought this up, the feedback between the algorithms and the data that feed them is crucially important as we think about this moving forward, because that's really where I see both the problem of capture most strongly and the possibility of change. I think about this, and this is a limit, thank you so much, with the time frame of the project, which starts in 2015, and I cut off in 2020 because I was like, this is going to change, and it did. The time frame of the project means that we're now talking a little bit more about generative AI. And generative AI, the more that it produces more content based on what exists, the more it's going to reproduce and reinforce linguistic strictures. And it becomes that much more important to think about language policies, to think about lit publishing structures, to think about prizes that can, on an institutional level, really encourage and support and celebrate Afrophone language literary production. So with all of that said, I think these questions of power, control, agency, language, identity, these are all really crucial. And I'm just deeply grateful for the chance to continue thinking with you all about them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's put our hands together for Susanna, and that's great. Yes, we are really managing our time well. 9 minutes past the hour of 12. So we have 21 minutes to go. Well, we would like members of the audience to speak in case you have any observation to make, or you have any question to ask, or you want to add to what's been said. You just raise your hand. You may just speak to us for a minute or two, and we'll just take it off from there. Yes, any takers? Yes, the one that ambushed me. So I like you to say something to what you've heard so far. Yes.
You've also plotted a coup for me, right?
Yes, I have plotted a coup for you. It's called counter coup.
Which is more bloody.
Yes.
Right. My name is Yemi Adil. I've listened to the different contributions from the speakers. First of all, let me congratulate the director. I didn't have access to today, but from the different reviews you people have made, I think it is a book that's going to stimulate a lot of interest among scholars of literature and linguistics. For me, as a statistician, semiotician, I see the digital space as one which has really defined literary activity in terms of moving beyond using linguistic devices into multimodal features. So I was wondering, when you people were reviewing the book, if there is an aspect of the chapter which looks at digital affordances of how writers in the digital space have been able to appropriate or deploy digital affordances to redefine poetry, or to move poetry away from the conventions that we know. Then the other side, because we are happy, I think there is an aspect of the book which also looks at morality. If young people are writing and you are looking at protest, there should be an area of protest culture. Do you find these young people in their use of linguistic devices or multimodal features appropriating some aspects of traditional ways of showing protest? For instance, how do they pour out invectives on leadership or to show their grievances and all the rest? If I'm just an old man, I may not be able to do any serious research again.
Old man, how old are you?
If I were to do any research in the nearest future, I think I'm going to write 2 separate big theses from what this wonderful scholar has shown.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Left answer that. Yes, I'm sure you might want to say a word or two or what you just, if just to say thank you for this opportunity or whatever, just say something.
Of course, Prof. Thank you. So
Thank you.
I was having a conversation with the author before the session began, and I was congratulating her for a very beautiful work. And of course, we have reviewed through my prof, and when my prof tells me something is beautifully written, it can be a critic. He can flip through all the pages, line, sentences by sentences, and pick out the shake, the shaking and rocking and tumbling and rumblings that he intended for, in this panel session. I want to congratulate you for a beautiful work. And like he said, I think I have I penned down a couple of points and highlights, and we actually look forward to engaging with the book for possible research works, projects, future things.
Thank you very much. Let's answer that. Yes. Yes. Okay, madam. Yeah. Okay.
So we are beginning from the Liberian for further investor on Portugal.
You're welcome.
Area of specialization is very high. Next during is the book converting Texas to the So I'm just here to support her before she will want to then keep my life.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Yes. Yes, any other person you want to say something before we now revert to the people here? All right.
Yeah, Jefferson.
Yes.
I want to plot another two.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Particularly for you.
Okay.
You raised a very germane question. What defines poetry.
Yeah, I'm coming.
And I think we should really engage it.
I'm coming to that.
Everybody seems to have a hand in writing poetry.
Yeah.
So what are the boundaries?
Yeah. Let me pick it up.
You want to pick it up?
Okay, that's very good. We have a poet here, and he's a professor of poetry, so he's going to answer you. But so he's going to take the bullet. Off you go. Henry.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In fact, I've been agitated to raise that issue as maybe my additional contribution to what we are discussing. So when we talk about poetry, it's now being some kind of commerce, but I think there should be some kind of gap. If you go to Wordsworth's definition of poetry, powerful overflow of what?
Yeah.
Of emotion in tranquility and with emotion. Fine. If you find that one, so if you pick a chant, is there any feeling that is conveying? Is there any emotion in it? If you have that one, then you know that. So it's only if you look at that definition, and for me, that is poetry. To have feelings and then convey kind of emotion. So if you have that, look at the lines that you have before you in terms of criticism. If they can convey that, I think they should pass as poetry. Or maybe incantation. What are they conveying? Or songs, do they have element of feelings that they have? And poetry is to convey feelings. So if they have it, I don't think they have any problem in defining them or classifying them as poetry. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Tosin, I'd like you to also weigh in on that, apart from what other thing you have on your mind.
You know, I work on hip hop, right?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yes, let's stop. We have 14 minutes. We have 14 minutes to go, so let's enjoy.
It's also a poet.
That's exactly, and so you have raised a very, very important question, and I like that. So that they could plotted the fool. You have not answered the question.
I will. Do you look at me like somebody will run? I don't want them to talk. Then I'll come in as chairperson. I don't want to.
But the way that I see it is that poetry can be many things, right? The same way that, for example, our ancestors were doing songs that we regard today as poetry, right? It's the same tradition that, for example, you have in rap music, where people, use the voice, to actually, and they use language in very specific ways, right? That's very, very intriguing. That sometimes I wonder if much of the poetry of Africa today is not even, in fact, living in rap music, rather than in print. And much of that is just really ignored, right? So, in other words, I just really wanted to say that my own understanding of poetry is very expansive. It can include chants, it can include incantations, or songs. A whole lot of a very broad category of material can fit into my own.
All right, let me just say this. Yes, poetry, just like life, is it resists tidy definition. It is at once interesting and mysterious as well, imbricating right from the very quotidian to the sacred. All right, you can even consider lullabies, as poetry, and you can talk about Ifa divination chants as also poetry. I'm using the Yoruba as a case study, so that for you to get a tidy, universally acceptable definition of poetry, is a will o' the wisp. We cannot get it. There's no way you can indeed say this is what constitutes poetry. But what is critically important is to know that language is used in a self-conscious manner, in a heightened manner. So you are looking, and language becomes almost tactile in its reflexiveness. And you are also bringing in the marriage of sound or sounding and imagery in order to try and cognize and concretize aspects of reality. So that's exactly what you do when you are talking about, indeed, poetry. Sounding is so critically important, just as Neo Shidari will tell us in a paper of his entitled English Words, Yoruba Thoughts. a poet's journey through the tunnel of two languages, of two tongues. That when two languages meet, they kiss and quarrel. So when indeed you think in Yoruba and you want to convey it in English, what are the strategies of mediation that you are going to use? You bring in some tricks of print, as Isidore Okpewo will talk about it in his book, Heritage of African Poetry, Tricks of Print. How do you convey it from the open course, open square, the oral environment, right onto the impersonality of the page, so that you crowd the page, you oralize the page, with what you are trying to say. That's when he talks about water on. That's exactly why it resonated with me. So indeed, talking about the issue of poetry, when we see poetry, we know. And according to Ulibaya, he says, when we try to translate Yoruba poetry into English, it is poetry that we remove. When you try to translate, because it's so profound, I have to repeat it. When you try to translate Yoruba into English, it is poetry that is lost. And Wole Soyinka in Ogboju Odeninu Igborumole, which is reference of 1,000 demons, it says that when you try to translate from Yoruba into English, something is lost and gained. So such is the intractability of the business of translation. How do you convey ideas encoded and inscribed in tone or tonal languages that use sound symbols, sound imagery, such as idiophones, onomatopoeia, tonal counterpoint? Page 3, waiting laughters, Niyosudare, the rain. The rain is onibamba tiba, up. They are critic marking. The second line says, the rain is onibamba tiba. You that are not Yoruba, you don't understand what is going on, because
let me do those lines for you.
So don't.
You don't do those lines.
Read the line.
The rain is onibamba tiba. Okay. The rain is onibamba tiba.
Okay.
Onibaba
tiba, which of course talks about the humongous nature, of the torrential downpour. So that is why Oshudare tells us in African communicative event, sounding is meaning. Meaning is sounding. We can say the same thing among South African indigenous poets. We can say the same thing among Malawian indigenous poets. We can say the same thing of Zimbabwean, because African languages are tone/tonal languages that operate at 3, language tone levels. When you talk about low, mid, high, one word can give you 10 different meanings depending on how you pronounce it. But the English language is fixed, it's stress timed, which follows, the alternation of high and low, high and low. So, for instance, you look at the English Shakespearean sonnet. Must I compare it to summer, the dim, 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 dim. But ours is more complex. So that when you are talking about the issue of rhythm, if rhythm is not got through rhyme scheme, but rather through the secretion of musicality that is encoded in the union of vowel and consonant sounds, so that the syllable becomes a unit of music. The syllable. When you say so you are conveying a lot of things, and it's reaching the people, and their response is instantaneous. It's on the spot. It's not like in the West, when you see it, you go to watch a theater, they wait until the critic will write on the back page. Right as you are pronouncing it there, they tell you, and you also brought it, I saw it here, that as you are chanting, if it is rubbing them the wrong way, they will tell you on the spot. So if you are doing it the wrong way, they tell you on the spot. And if what you are doing is resonating with them, they say, okay, line, that is what you are doing. It's right there. So in terms of poetry, consumption, reception, and the rest of it, in Africa, the audience participation is instant. Mm-hmm. They participate in it. Mm-hmm. And that is because of our gregarious, communal nature here. So many things to talk about in terms of the nature of the African, the nature of our culture and things like that. Because I feel even some of the authorities you cited is overwhelmingly Western as well. So because I went through the table of content, and not the table of content, the index. I went through the work cited. I didn't see people like Oshundare, Tanuro, Jaide, and Oshundare, and even showing car. I don't think it, except for Kibo.
That's true.
I know you were working on Southern Africa, but these are people whose voices, their pronouncement is so overwhelmingly, authoritative that they could be cited. But when you cite people only in the West, maybe the other side of the Atlantic, either in Europe, in America, and the rest of it. I know that your work is being done in the US and all of that, but you are working, your data is on Africa. And Africa should not just be limited to South Africa, even if that is your primary, geography of interest. So you can also go further afield to look at parallels and things like that, and quote the authorities on African literature, African poetry, such as these people that I mentioned. For me, I wasn't particularly too pleased that I wasn't seeing some of the people we know of, talk about Dennis Brutus, for instance, I thought about Mechareta, Oko Pibite, all of them. They were not very strongly represented.
I appreciate that. And I want to, do I have time to resume? Is that allowed? Okay, so a couple of things. First, I appreciate your concern about defending the structure of poetry and how we think about poetry. I actually share some of your concerns about what these digital mediations, the way that we engage with texts online, might shape our reception of poetry, because I think you're right, the depth, the complexity, that's not necessarily rewarded or encouraged through a digital receptive, sort of through digital platforms and how that audience engagement works. And so while I'm not interested in particularly making judgments or delineations of what is and isn't poetry, because I don't feel that's my place, I do think there's meaningful questions to be addressed around the relationship between the types of readings that are available to us and what kinds of literary production and the depth of meaning invest in them. It could be hip hop that is meaningful, but I also think we can make that is poetic, but I also think we can make astute judgments about what kinds of messages are conveyed and under what circumstances. However, I do, Professor, I'm sorry, I really appreciate your engagement and your thoughtfulness. I think it's really important. I try actually quite a lot to ensure that my theoretical paradigms around what constitutes poetry, around who I'm looking at, around the sociality of poetry are not rooted in the West. And so while I actually am taking down notes and really appreciate some of these other scholars who are West African that you're suggesting, because I do think that the Pan-African and intracontinental conversation is crucially important. I also, in this text, really did deliberately choose to focus on local traditions and regional traditions. And so I focused a lot actually on Southern African, South African, Malawian poets and theorists of poetry to develop, and sometimes in response to them, sometimes I don't agree, but to develop my theorization of how poetry works socially in conversation with sociological frameworks that are coming from the West as well as from Southern Africa. I will acknowledge, and I think this is a really important critique, that I've not engaged with West African poetry. There's a lot of conversations to be had there. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the specificity that it's not universal, that there are particularities within regional contexts. And so it's worth engaging on those terms. And I'm sorry to interrupt in that way, because I do really appreciate any kind of moment of freedom, because being based in the West, frankly, I don't have the same exposure. And I'm keenly aware of that. And so I'm eager to learn, but I also do want to defend my choice in this context to focus on Southern African theorists.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we put our hands together for that? Yes, I have 2 minutes to go, but I'm just going to give everybody 30 seconds to speak. Let's just take it in this, is it anti-clockwise or clockwise? So, yeah, Gabriel.
Oh yeah, I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah.
I just want to say this looks like a setup. Most of us forget we are poets.
Okay, yeah.
Because of,
okay.
and I just wanted to say that, reading this book, I can connect with, what Funke was saying earlier.
Okay.
Because before I got so busy with, academic work, I used to do all this image macros.
Yeah.
I used to post before everything got connected, before Meta, harmonized everything. I will have my post on Twitter. I will screenshot the Twitter and post it on Instagram and on Facebook, Facebook and otherwise.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
that's how you've used it.
I just want to say.
Thank you for your 30 seconds. Oh yeah, Henry.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
What I just want to add is that the book will continue to generate ideas, and then arguments as long as the critics will handle it. Thank you very much.
All right. Tosin.
I just want to say thank you for for giving us this book. I really appreciate the work that went into it.
Thank you very much. Afunke.
Yeah, thank you. And also, and I've learned so much from this panel. I'll keep doing what I'm doing because I want to be visible at work.
All right. It's 12:30. I want to thank everybody for coming. God bless you and have fun. Thank you. And the guy, Dele, do you have a second for us? Maybe you are stay for like 30 seconds. Quickly. We are about to leave.
Yes, sir. I'm sure I'm going to read the book again.
Okay. Okay.
I'm going to Thank you, Susan Sachs.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
No, even the time you took was even more than those of us. It's how to, you got on here, you get what 10 minutes, you spend about 1 hour.
Kí ló dé o fẹ́ pa kẹ́tẹ́kẹ́tẹ́ ni? Thank you. Thank you. Hey, well done. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, very much. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and it's just